All right, so the seminar is about security force assistance in weak states. So this means the provision of resources and training to armed forces in countries that have pretty weak state institutions, politically unstable. So the puzzle that we're interested in is what explains the appearance of military capacity through SFA, security force assistance. And Department of Defense gave us a bunch of money, and I think their interest was not only let's explain why that happens, but how can we make that happen? And that's a first order explanation of what we do. I think that what's actually more interesting to me as a political scientist is it's a deeper question about where do institutions come from. So if you don't have a system of political order that's really institutionalized, that suffers from instability, at some point in a lot of places, you get a critical juncture, that change happens. So what we're doing is we're using security force assistance as a proxy to try to figure out where that change happens. And in a nutshell, that's sort of really the main argument. And I can get deeper into the weeds about it, and gosh, I can tell you a lot about security force assistance, how that operates, but there's your argument. With provider countries, and in my case, this is the United States and its NATO partners, that security force assistance in their process terms, it's the provision of resources and training to armed forces of other countries. The purpose of it, well, there's a lot of debate about that. Why do you want to make armed forces in another country stronger? It can be because those armed forces might be a proxy in terms of our US or NATO competition in other parts of the world. But there could be other aims as well, such as cultivation of influence and sort of more open-ended objectives. The idea that it's a good idea if you have military-to-military relations, or more generally a country's relations to military in another country, because you never know what happens in the future, and for good or bad, sometimes it's convenient to have somebody that you can call. I'll take that as a two-part. The challenge is about failure, and this is the genesis of the project, which was started pre-COVID. So the idea was, after experiences in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, why is it that the U.S. spends billions of dollars helping to build armies in other places, and then suddenly these armed forces collapse? The conventional wisdom was that this was a principal agent problem, so that we have a particular interest. We want strong military. Well, government X, government of Afghanistan, let's say, that government wants a strong military because it faces a threat from insurgents. But the interests aren't really the same as ours, because it could be that that government was being protected by our military. Our government's also giving money to Afghans to build their military. Well, if the U.S. and its partners are protecting Afghanistan's government, why should they actually use that money to build their military? Maybe they want to give it to their friends, or give it to themselves, or whatever. And the root problem is that, like a lot of weakly institutionalized, unstable governments, there's a lot of concern that if they actually do build their own military capacity, that this will raise the probability of a coup. And people to whom resources and responsibility are delegated and they do a good job with it, sometimes they begin to think that they can do other jobs, like maybe we are better than the government at doing these things. So that's the mismatch. That's a problem of security force assistance to really weak states. That was more or less the norm outside of new NATO partner countries through a lot of the 30 years after the end of the Cold War. What's changed is security force assistance now is being directed much more towards what I would call partners who are involved in strategic competition. So countries such as Ukraine, which also has pretty weak institutions and has had problems with corruption. But that principal-agent relationship is quite different in that case. First of all, it's a government that has faced invasion that tends to focus the mind. But what's interesting to us intellectually is that in that critical juncture, you see the government of Ukraine using security force assistance in a very different way than Afghanistan's government. So that government's taking all kinds of risks, doing all sorts of, I guess, experiments with US and NATO assistance to try to build institutions in a way that can both fight Russian invaders and be indigenized into a larger political order in Ukraine. See, that's what's really interesting to us, because in historic terms, this is how new political orders are created. It's happening very quickly in Ukraine. It's what our funders, I think, hoped would happen, maybe in some of the other states that U.S. has provided a lot of security force assistance. But in the end, really the interest comes down to this fundamental question: where do institutions come from? And under what conditions are they built, and can they be sustained? In my experience, I mean, each case has its own explanations, but I think the generalization would be that successful groups are groups that are able to use social resources around them, oftentimes repurposing them for their own objectives. So in other words, leveraging resources, social resources that other people might not see or that they discount, but leveraging them in a way that makes that group stronger and that group more embedded in the society. I mean, in an earlier time, the non-state armed group that could do that would become the state. I mean, we live in a different type of international system now, but jihadists, for example, are in many cases in sub-Saharan Africa, these are groups that have a sort of ideological and organizational genealogy that goes back to state builders over the past several centuries. In Sahel Africa, for example, it's jihadist groups that have been the most proficient builders of states. Only today we have a different reference point, so we say, well, they can't be the state. So that's a problem, though, for security force assistance to the de jure recognized states, because in some places like Somalia, that state that gets a significant amount of external backing, including SFA, might not be the legitimate political authority for people who live in that area. In fact, it may be a jihadist group like Al-Shabaab that really acts more like the state. I mean, I could be agnostic about the situation and say, well, you know, if that's a more legitimate group and that sort of looks more state-like, shouldn't we give that assistance? But the world doesn't work that way. Boy, factors of state legitimacy, I'll take that very broadly. I think that one factor of state legitimacy is simply the existence of countries today as independent sovereign entities, that whatever kind of government people have, there's a surprisingly long or strong attachment to that idea of a state. I mean, one view was that these were hand-me-down colonial states and that Africa's different ethnic groups, that there'd be more solidarity within that ethnic group. But even in countries that do have communal violence, I think that people who study this find that there's a pretty strong attachment to that idea of the contemporary state. Now that said, governments in such places are not necessarily enjoying a lot of legitimacy among the population. So I think at that level, one of the main factors of legitimacy is a political system in which there's some sort of elite accommodation or bargaining, so that communities feel as though whatever the arrangement is in the capital, it's not necessarily a zero-sum thing. They're not irrevocably blocked from participation in that government. And that's true whether a government's authoritarian or democratic. And I think part of the tragedy of politics that we see in some of the big African states, particularly in the Sahel region, is that these elite accommodations have broken down, and that's really the risk of a dissolution of a political order. And I think attendant with that is a pretty profound crisis of legitimacy. But there could also be authoritarian states that populations do find quite legitimate. But again, it's this assurance that if one is on the outs politically, there is a possibility of some kind of re-entry, and that those who are in power at that time, that they can provide some sort of credible assurance that will happen.